Passamos, então, a palavra ao professor Eduardo Pazrada, para que ele possa fazer a sua fala. Obrigada, professor. Seja muito bem-vindo. Muito obrigada.
Buenas noches a todos ustedes. Quiero agradecer a la profesora Magda y a la asociación por la invitación para poder compartir con ustedes la experiencia de las transformaciones políticas y sociales en Bolivia y que están vinculadas directamente a una reflexión en torno a la democracia y las políticas públicas en el Estado plurinacional de Bolivia. Quiero iniciar señalando que en los años que transcurren del siglo XXI se ha transformado radicalmente un conjunto de aspectos de la vida social, cultural, económica y política de Bolivia, especialmente por la emergencia protagónica de actores sociales que estuvieron durante siglos excluidos, explotados, dominados y discriminados y que ahora se han convertido en sujetos activos de los cambios sustanciales que se producen en Bolivia y que además aportan de una manera central a una construcción de una democracia a profundidad, de una democracia intensa en Bolivia. Los movimientos sociales son los protagonistas centrales de esta transformación. Están constituidos por organizaciones sindicales de campesinos, de colonizadores, de mujeres indígenas campesinas, de indígenas de las zonas altiplánicas y también de indígenas de las zonas bajas de Bolivia. Los sindicatos de trabajadores que están organizados en la Central Obrera Boliviana tuvieron una actividad menos intensa, sobre todo porque fueron afectados duramente por las reformas neoliberales de los años 80 y 90. Sin embargo, en los últimos años, en los dos últimos 3 años, nuevamente tienen una presencia importante en Bolivia. Quiero hacer una diferencia entre dos periodos importantes del desarrollo democrático en Bolivia. Primero, el de la etapa neoliberal del periodo 1985-2003 y luego cómo se va transformando la propia democracia en los años que van del 2005 al 2007. Es decir, nos va a permitir esta diferenciación de los momentos políticos en Bolivia, ver qué alcance tiene la democracia en uno y en otro caso. La democracia neoliberal estuvo marcada por el predominio de los partidos políticos, del tutelaje de la estrategia del gobierno de Estados Unidos, y esta democracia de este periodo tuvo como titulares a los empresarios privados en el gobierno y en los ministerios y el desmantelamiento de las políticas sociales y una precariedad instrumental del Estado, en tanto que la democracia nacional popular de estos últimos años, que tiene en los sindicatos y en los movimientos sociales los actores centrales, han impulsado el liderazgo de Evo Morales como líder de estos movimientos. A la Asamblea Constituyente que se desarrolló en los años 2006-2008 como una instancia política que generó un reordenamiento del Estado plurinacional. Por tanto, estos dos momentos nos van a permitir advertir estas transformaciones a las que he hecho referencia. Previamente, tal vez una un acercamiento histórico a la realidad boliviana, ¿no?, para poder entender qué importancia y qué impacto tienen las reformas de los últimos años. Quiero señalar que los grupos de dominio en Bolivia han estado constituidos por los terratenientes, los propietarios de minas, los comerciantes, los militares y la burocracia, que han heredado un orden colonial en el cual la exclusión de las grandes mayorías, sobre todo indígenas, campesinos, trabajadores de las minas y otros, han estado fuera de toda expectativa y de toda presencia en la vida política. Quienes han manejado la política en Bolivia han sido pequeños sectores de la oligarquía que no han fortalecido el Estado, más bien lo han debilitado permanentemente en función de la lógica de explotar los recursos naturales, primero la minería y luego el petróleo y el gas, exportando los capitales y dejando a Bolivia en una situación muy debilitada en un país invertebrado como es el boliviano. Un momento importante de este proceso histórico ha sido el de la Revolución Nacional del año 1952, cuando también una emergencia de campesinos y de mineros permitió realizar una serie de transformaciones que permiten advertir un primer cambio a lo largo de la historia de 200 años de Bolivia. Y son una referencia inicial que tiene que ver con el proceso democrático electoral. En 1900, Bolivia tenía 1,5 millones de habitantes y votaban solamente 40.000 personas, es decir, el 2,6% definía el destino del país. 50 años después, en 1951, el país tenía 2,7 millones de habitantes y votaron 129.000 personas, es decir, el 5%. Luego de la Revolución del 52, cuando en Bolivia había 3 millones de habitantes, votaron 955.000 personas, es decir, el 30%. Luego de 50 años, el año 2002, cuando en Bolivia había 8 millones de habitantes, votaron 2,9 millones de habitantes, un 35%. Y ahora, en las elecciones del año 2009, con 10 millones de habitantes en Bolivia, votaron 4,8 millones de habitantes, el 48%. Sin duda, a nivel de cambios en el siglo XX, podemos advertir que en el tema exclusivamente electoral ha habido un cambio importante y una mayor participación en las decisiones a este nivel. Ahora, ¿qué pasa en Bolivia en estos últimos 30 años? Entre el año 1985 y el 2017. Podemos advertir que hay una primera etapa de la democracia con los pactos de partidos políticos y que estos partidos han estado vinculados a los sectores empresariales de la Confederación de Empresarios Privados, de la Cámara Agropecuaria del Oriente y a las transnacionales mineras y petroleras que aplicaron las medidas neoliberales que fueron traídas a Bolivia por el Fondo Monetario Internacional y el Banco Mundial y el respaldo directo de Estados Unidos. En cambio, en una segunda fase de este proceso democrático de los últimos 30 años, entre el 2005 y el 2017, que estuvo precedida por una rebelión popular el año 2003, año en el cual los movimientos sociales protagonizaron la expulsión de los partidos políticos e impusieron un nuevo modelo de democracia sobre la base de los movimientos sociales a los que hice referencia hace un momento y que tienen en el movimiento al socialismo y en Evo Morales su representación principal. Ahora voy a hacer una referencia a lo que fue el proceso político en estos últimos años, sobre todo tomando en cuenta la transformación de la democracia neoliberal, ¿no?, que tuvo como característica el imponer a través de los partidos políticos, el MNR al presidente Víctor Paz Estenssoro en su momento, la Acción Democrática Nacionalista a Hugo Banzer Suárez, quien fue un dictador en la época de los 70, y al movimiento de izquierda revolucionaria que impulsó a Jaime Paz Zamora, pero que tuvo una transformación este partido que se llamaba de izquierda y se convirtió prácticamente en un aliado de los partidos neoliberales en ese periodo. La característica de las reformas de los años 80 y 90 estuvo caracterizada por quitar al Estado toda capacidad de gestión para que pase a manos de los sectores privados, ¿no? El movimiento obrero y sindical fue prácticamente anulado sobre la base de la destrucción de las empresas productivas, particularmente las empresas mineras, lo que llevó a una elevada desocupación en el país. Y en este contexto de debilitamiento del Estado y de la minería es que van a emerger nuevos movimientos populares, particularmente los campesinos, los productores de hoja de coca, a los cuales representa Evo Morales, y que el gobierno de Estados Unidos estableció que la hoja de coca es una hoja ilegal porque en el caso de Estados Unidos consideran que la coca, que es una materia prima para la cocaína, lleva a Estados Unidos como un país altamente consumidor de esta droga. Sin embargo, la coca en su estado natural no tiene ninguna composición que sea considerada una droga. Ahora, ¿qué ocurre en Bolivia en estos últimos años a partir de lo que fue el levantamiento popular del año 2003, que fue precedido por la llamada Guerra del Agua? La Guerra del Agua, que fue una acción popular amplia en Cochabamba, una ciudad importante de Bolivia, cuando querían privatizar el agua por unas transnacionales norteamericanas y canadienses, se produjo un levantamiento popular. Ya fue una primera llamada de atención al orden neoliberal vigente. Inmediatamente después vino la guerra del gas. Esta guerra del gas ya tuvo una característica mucho más profunda, porque no solamente fue un levantamiento por reivindicar, ¿no?, que el gas sea utilizado internamente en Bolivia y no exportado, sino que llevó además a expulsar del gobierno y expulsar del control del Estado a los partidos tradicionales. La guerra del gas, este levantamiento del 2003, impuso en el país lo que se llamó la Agenda de Octubre, que luego va a tener consecuencias importantes porque esta Agenda de Octubre determinó en primer lugar que se nacionalicen los recursos del gas y del petróleo boliviano y en segundo lugar que se convoque a una asamblea constituyente, una asamblea que transforme políticamente el país. ¿Y quiénes impulsan esto? Las que se llamaron organizaciones del Pacto de Unidad. ¿Quiénes conforman el Pacto de Unidad? La Confederación de Campesinos de Bolivia, la Confederación de Mujeres Campesinas Bartolina Sisa, la Confederación de Colonizadores, la Confederación de Indígenas del Oriente y el Consejo Nacional de Ayllus y Marcas del Collasuyo. Esta este conjunto de organizaciones va a impulsar la candidatura de Evo Morales, que va a ganar las elecciones el año 2006, ¿no? Y que va este pacto de unidad transformar la composición social de los poderes del Estado. Cuando el gabinete de ministros, como la Cámara de Diputados, de senadores y el cuerpo diplomático, está conformado ahora por grupos campesinos, representantes indígenas, representantes cocaleros, dirigentes vecinales y de organizaciones políticas de izquierda. Es decir, hay una transformación de los titulares de la vida política en el país. La Asamblea Constituyente del año 2006 al 2008 va a transformar el país y va a considerar que es imprescindible que adopte una otra perspectiva. Por eso va a constituir el Estado plurinacional de Bolivia, reconociendo a las naciones y a los pueblos indígenas, reconociendo las autonomías municipales, regionales y también las autonomías indígenas. Esta Constitución se aprueba el año 2009, ¿no?, de una manera movilizada de los sectores populares del país. Posteriormente se van a producir un conjunto de problemas y debates dentro del propio gobierno del movimiento al socialismo, con algunas controversias con los sectores indígenas de las zonas bajas, ¿no?, los indígenas que minoritariamente viven en el país, pero que nunca habían sido reconocidos como tales. Ahora, el contexto internacional fue muy importante para lo que ocurrió en Bolivia en estos años. Hay que tomar en cuenta que en Venezuela había ganado las elecciones el presidente Hugo Chávez, en el Brasil aquí había ganado las elecciones Lula da Silva, en Argentina había ganado las elecciones Néstor Kirchner, y juntos pudieron en ese momento, el año 2005, evitar que se aplique la política del libre comercio impulsada por Estados Unidos. En Mar del Plata, en noviembre del 2005, prácticamente se rechaza la política norteamericana en América Latina y paulatinamente se van a formar procesos de integración como el ALBA, UNASUR y CELAC, que van a dar una otra fisonomía a la democracia en nuestros países, pero además impulsando, ¿no?, una articulación, una integración entre los países de América Latina. Por tanto, podemos decir que el avance político en Bolivia está vinculado a lo que ha estado ocurriendo en América Latina con este impulso de una nueva perspectiva de integración latinoamericana y de una presencia en la cual América Latina sea escuchada a nivel mundial, ¿no? Y particularmente Brasil en ese periodo va a jugar un papel muy importante porque se va a convertir en la cabeza de un conjunto de países que llevan adelante procesos de transformación social y política con una mayor inclusión social. Ahora, ¿qué pasa en Bolivia en el campo económico en este periodo? Las relaciones coloniales y de dominación que han sido muy importantes durante todo el periodo republicano van a ir cambiando en el periodo de este Estado plurinacional que todavía está en construcción, porque ahora van a ser básicamente los indígenas campesinos, quechuas, aymaras y de los grupos indígenas de la zona del Amazonas boliviano que van a tener un mayor protagonismo y van a impulsar una transformación de aquello que habían hecho los organismos internacionales como el Fondo Monetario Internacional y el Banco Mundial en Bolivia. En la última década, en el gobierno de Evo Morales, ¿qué es lo que va a suceder en Bolivia? A partir de la nacionalización del gas que estaba en manos de las transnacionales, se va a producir un conjunto de reformas y transformaciones. El crecimiento del Producto Interno Bruto, del PIB, en los últimos años fue del 5% de promedio. De 9.500 millones de dólares del PIB el 2005 va a subir a 33.800 millones de dólares en 2016. Las exportaciones de gas a Brasil y Argentina son la fuente principal de ingresos y el Estado pasó a tener una participación del 35% en el conjunto de la economía nacional, cuando el año 2002 tan solamente alcanzaba al 18%. Las reservas netas del Estado boliviano han pasado de 1.700 millones de dólares en 2002 a 10.000 millones de dólares en 2016. Las transformaciones económicas tienen en el Estado al actor principal. El gobierno de Evo Morales contó con importantes recursos procedentes de distintas actividades económicas, pero principalmente la exportación de gas, que fueron destinados estos recursos primero a los gobiernos departamentales, municipales y a las universidades públicas. Se llevó adelante una distribución de los recursos a través de bonos a los niños que estudian, a las madres embarazadas y a los ancianos. En tercer lugar, se distribuyó estos recursos en infraestructura, en educación, salud y deportes. Luego, en cuarto lugar, a proyectos de atención en servicios básicos y finalmente la inversión en infraestructura y proyectos productivos. Según datos del Ministerio de Economía, se han transferido 3.000 millones de bolivianos a las gobernaciones, más de 2.400 millones a las alcaldías municipales, y las universidades autónomas han recibido 3 veces más de recursos que en la década anterior. De manera agregada, el gasto social del gobierno central del Estado plurinacional evolucionó sostenidamente desde 9.500 millones de bolivianos en 2005 a 29.000 millones de bolivianos en 2016. El gasto en vivienda subió de 263 millones de bolivianos en 2005 a 2.000 millones de bolivianos en 2016. En salud, de 1.200 millones en 2005 a 4.300 millones en 2016. En educación, de 4.600 millones de bolivianos en 2005 a 12.000 millones de bolivianos en 2016. Y en protección social, de 3.400 millones en 2005 a 10.000 millones en 2016. Por otra parte, fueron importantes los gastos destinados a niños y jóvenes bajo el denominado Bono Juancito Pinto, que permite que se evite la deserción escolar, que bajó de 5% a 1% en este periodo. El bono para las mujeres embarazadas de 1.800 bolivianos permitió también que se reduzcan los niveles de mortalidad infantil y de mortalidad materna. El total de la población beneficiada con la entrega de bonos fue de casi 4 millones de personas, es decir, el 36% de la población distribuida en 1.800 millones de estudiantes, casi 1 millón de ancianos y más de 1 millón de madres y niños menores de 2 años que recibieron todos estos apoyos. Tomando en cuenta los parámetros de los objetivos del milenio, la tasa de desnutrición en Bolivia bajó de 32% en 2005 a 14% en 2016. La tasa de mortalidad infantil bajó de 52 por 1.000 nacidos vivos en 2005 a 34 por 1000 nacidos vivos en 2016. La razón de mortalidad materna bajó de 229 por 100.000 nacidos vivos a 160 por 100.000 nacidos vivos. La esperanza de vida pasó de 65 años en 2005 a 70 años en 2016. En la comparación del año 2005 con el 2016 se han producido importantes políticas destinadas a mejorar las condiciones de vida de la población, con conexiones domiciliarias que pasaron de 40.000 a 600.000 familias, favoreciendo a más de 2,5 millones de habitantes. El salario mínimo vital se incrementó desde 440 bolivianos en 2005 a 2.000 bolivianos en 2017. La tasa de desempleo bajó de 8% a 4%. La extrema pobreza, que en 2005 era de 38%, cayó a 16% en 2015. La pobreza moderada, que era de 60% en Bolivia, en 2005 se redujo a 38% en 2015. Por tanto, los avances sociales y la reducción de pobreza fue muy importante en estos años. Sin embargo, todavía en el país, en relación a los países vecinos, tiene elevados niveles de pobreza y de tasas en estos aspectos que hemos señalado. Finalmente, quiero hacer una reflexión sobre los cambios que se han producido en Bolivia en los últimos años. En los ámbitos de la inclusión y la igualdad, dos aspectos destacan de la gestión en el Estado plurinacional. Por una parte, el control de los recursos naturales y de las empresas de importancia económica que han pasado al Estado, y los recursos generados por estas empresas han sido redistribuidos a la gran mayoría de la población. El debate por el excedente entre las empresas transnacionales y el Estado nacional ha permitido una derrota de las empresas transnacionales en favor del Estado nacional. Si bien todavía la economía mantiene un carácter primario exportador, se han dado importantes impulsos a la industrialización en diversos sectores de la economía y que, aún en el contexto de atraso, se han ejecutado políticas soberanas, ¿no?, frente a los Estados Unidos y al Fondo Monetario Internacional. Tomando en cuenta una historia de inestabilidad política durante 200 años y de vulnerabilidad externa, la última década ha permitido marcar tendencias a una mayor fortaleza económica y política, cultural y social en Bolivia, a través de una nueva constitución política del Estado plurinacional que ha formado un nuevo bloque de poder con los sectores campesinos, indígenas, con mujeres populares, con sectores indígenas que ahora tienen una participación directa en el control del país. Ahora, desafíos están presentes, sobre todo por los cambios en el contexto internacional y regional. Hay un cambio geopolítico a nivel mundial donde Estados Unidos ha perdido esa centralidad que tenía antes y son varios ahora los actores de la política internacional, y América Latina y en el contexto latinoamericano Bolivia tienen desafíos que sin embargo se hacen difíciles tomando en cuenta los cambios políticos ocurridos en Brasil y en Argentina, que tienden a aplicar nuevamente políticas neoliberales que traerían problemas a toda la región. Considero finalmente que el proceso de los últimos 15 años en América Latina ha permitido un ascenso de los sectores que han estado históricamente marginados y excluidos. En ese contexto, la política brasileña de los años anteriores, de la década del 2004 al 2014, ha permitido también una mayor vinculación en la integración latinoamericana, en el impulso a una mayor complementación económica y política, y que en los últimos 2 años este proceso se ha visto debilitado especialmente por las políticas de Brasil y de la Argentina. Sin embargo, quiero reflexionar que la construcción de la identidad latinoamericana tiene una larga tradición, y para eso quiero recordar a Darcy Ribeiro, este cientista social brasileño que ha trabajado profundamente para poder entender que es imprescindible la unidad de América Latina, buscando una identidad propia de América Latina frente a las políticas coloniales desde Europa y desde los Estados Unidos. Frente a la dominación y a la alienación cultural, Darcy Ribeiro planteó la necesidad de una conciencia crítica en América Latina. Por eso quiero, al terminar mi presentación, hacer un homenaje a este importante intelectual brasileño, Darcy Ribeiro, que permite a los latinoamericanos y a los bolivianos, en el caso mío, tener como desafío la necesidad de la unidad, la integración latinoamericana emancipadora, y que sea una emancipación de los pueblos que luchan por la liberación y por una América Latina unida. Muchísimas gracias.
Passamos agora a palavra para a professora Charlotte Alperne.
All right, so good evening, everyone. Boa noite. I'm not going to speak in, that's the only thing I can manage, in Portuguese for tonight, so I'm going to speak in English, sorry. I think, well, I would like first to start by thanking the organizers of the ENEPCP Congress for having me here, and especially Magda for the invitation. And all of you for still being here, because it's quite a late hour. And especially because the organizers have asked me to tell you a little bit about a theoretical approach we've been developing in Paris. So not only is it late, but I'm going to tell you about policy instrumentation. And I will try to get you into the work we've been doing with our colleagues in Paris. So this is more or less the program, and I hope I won't be speaking too quickly, so please don't hesitate to tell me if I need to slow down or to make some more elements about what I will be saying. So why tell you about policy instrumentation? And in a way, it is a very different presentation than the one we just heard, but I think there is some issue related to it, because in the end, it's about understanding the extent to which public authorities, the public sector, political authorities can develop forms of collective action, and what are the means in order to reach such collective action. So this is the way through which we've been working on this. It's a collective research agenda. I'm not the only one working in this in Sciences Po. It's 3 of us mainly. My colleagues, Professor Patrick Le Gallès and also Professor Pierre Lascoum, have been developing this research agenda, and I've started working with them some 6 years ago when I joined the Centre d'études européennes et de politique comparée in Paris. So we come from different backgrounds, and the starting point for this research project was very much linked to some very empirical observations. The first one was implementation failure. You know, we always talk about the huge gap between big political ambitions and then what is being achieved in practice through policy implementation. And the second empirical observation was also some doubts regarding some of the big paradigms that had been developed in public policy analysis, in policy studies, in order to make sense of this gap. So we very much started from this observation, from our different perspective. Pierre Lascoum working on law, he's a law scholar, on governability and very much inspired by management sciences. Patrick Le Gallès works more on accountability issues, especially in the UK, in Great Britain, but also about governance studies. And myself in the work I've been doing was more about the relationship between public policy on the one hand and social movements on the other. So this is the different backgrounds. So what have we been doing? 3 points really that I would like to explain and maybe make sense of the project we've been developing. The first idea is to start understanding, analyzing state restructuring, the changing role of the state through the lenses of policy instruments. So this is the first idea that we started developing. So this approach very much derives from a critique of how the state restructuring has been thought before, right? I've told you about this ambitious approach to state, a very grandiose conception of what the state can achieve, very much a monolith, a leviathan in a sense that can achieve everything, and to rediscover the role of the state in the light of daily practices. So this is very much the kind of literature we drew upon. And looking at policy instruments, we suggest going one step beyond and trying to analyze the state and governing practices through their material dimension, through the everyday practice of governing. So it's a research project that very much draws at the conjunction of different literature, right? So there is a strong inspiration by Max Weber, the state as a big industrial enterprise. It goes also in the direction of Theodore Lowy and the work done on the capacity to sanction according to the public and to the kind of target that is being reached. Christopher Hood, of course, on tools of government. But also other works, I'm not sure that all of you are familiar with, but people such as Porter or Desrosières have been looking at large numbers, at quantification, at statistics, and the way through which they contribute to the daily practice of governing and state restructuring. It also very much draws on the work done by Foucault on the everyday practice of power, of the statization of society, and what is the impact on the way through which public policy is being implemented. So the way through which discipline, supervision, control, but also power is being exercised in a more concrete way. And last but not least, I have not referred too much to my public policy scholars and fellows, but we also worked a lot with some of the work done by Michael Howlett, for example, in Canada, working more on policy design in a somewhat more functionalist approach. But when we look at the work done in public policy, this is something I've learned when I was a student in public policy. You know, instruments didn't matter much, right? It was I think Peter Hall called that a third order of change. So it's really the last dimension you want to look at. If you want to understand policy change, you want to look at ideas, you want to look at structure, you want to look at power, you want to look at actors, you know, the real important stuff. But instrument is always the latest dimension that is being understood. And when we consider the work done by Lasswell, for example, its instruments are only understood in a very, well, he calls that a pragmatist approach, but it's very much a functionalist approach, right? We're talking about policy tools as a toolbox. You know, you could just take out one instrument in order to reach a policy goal. And this is the way through which very much a very efficiency-driven approach and understanding of the choice and the selection of policy instruments. So the approach that was developed by Pierre Lascombe and Patrick Le Gallès first, looking at policy instruments, was to say, well, let's try to take policy instruments seriously. Let's try to see what does it tell us? How relevant is it to try to understand logic of policy making, of state restructuring, if we focus on policy instruments, on their evolution over time? So they proposed to define this as a specific institution, so policy instruments as a specific institution. And as an institution, it combines on the one hand a technical, a material dimension, so for example, a tax, it could be a law, a regulation, a decree. It could also be a charter, it could be a strategic planning tool, it could be a material dimension, but it's also combined with a more social device, a more social representation on the ultimate goal that is being reached through this project. And I think you've addressed the issue of neoliberal policies, for example, and neoliberalization paradigm and ideas. And part of the debate today regarding policy instruments is whether or not this material dimension is combined or not with ideas, neoliberal ideas, and the way through which state should be dismantled. And this is very much one part of the debate. But it could also be a modernist paradigm. It could also be another type of social representation. So the idea is to combine the material dimension of tools, the very concrete material dimension, together with the social device, the social representation. And through this approach, in which policy instruments are considered as institutions, it contributes to explaining how the representation of a specific policy issue, the framing of an issue, is being stabilized. It also tells us a little bit how specific actors are being legitimized vis-à-vis others, but also the way through which collective action is being sustained over time. So in this perspective, and I'm aware of the fact that maybe it's very fast, maybe I'm going too fast explaining this, and I'm happy to discuss this afterwards in the discussion, but the focus is much more on the choice and the selection of policy instruments, considering that policy instruments and this process is not a neutral one, that it is a highly political one. It's not just a functional choice, it's not just a toolbox that you have at your disposal as a policymaker, as a decision maker, but by choosing one instrument over another one, then there is a specific political process taking place. In this perspective, these instruments also have long-term effects of their own by creating different target groups, by creating clienteles, but also by reallocating resources over time. And some of the work we've been doing in our group is, for example, on the relationship between the urban areas and the more rural areas, and try to see how some of those policy instruments have contributed over 150 years' time, for example, in terms of property rights, being one example, to redistribute and reallocate resources between different kinds of areas in a country. So policy instruments can also be, in this perspective, an interesting approach to understanding the reproduction of inequalities over time, to understand the way through which power is being allocated between social groups and also between different types of territories. So that's one point. And then going further on this approach, a second part of the work was very much linked to policy instrumentation. So not just the choice and the selection of instruments, but how they are combined with one another. How policy objectives are made material, how they are made operational, how is a policy objective transformed into is made operational. And as you well know, in a number of programs, it's not just a single instrument that is being chosen. In a number of laws, in a number of policy programs, it usually is a combination between different types of instruments. A program is rarely mono-instrumental in this particular sense. And in this particular case, it raises new issues of coordination, it raises issues of overlapping, but also the way through which coordination is ensured over time. It's not just about understanding the choice and selection of instruments, but also the long-term outcomes. What does it produce? What kind of results in terms of inequality, in terms of policy change? Again, this the choice at the beginning was to try to understand state restructuring. So this is very much the first step of this research program, was to look at state restructuring through the lenses of policy instruments. In a second stage, and this is when I joined the team, we started looking more systematically to public policy instrumentation as a way to understand logic of collective action. And this is maybe something that may be of interest to you, especially as I understand that there are different ways here to consider the fields of the public domain. Well, in this second step of the work, we started discussing with other disciplines. We started looking at what was being done in other research areas. And the key issue we addressed there was not state restructuring this time, but it was more to understand how collective action is organized. How do actors cooperate? And to what extent do public policy instruments contribute to such collective action? So in the debate we engaged with other disciplines, we started talking in particular to the sciences of management, for once, who was looking at policy instruments, at techniques, at devices as the material support for collective action. We've also looked at the work done by I have the acronym, but I forget. So to look at socio-technical studies, and especially the work being done by Acriche and by Latour, who are not so far away from us in Paris, but discussing with them, in which they consider policy instruments as intermediaries of collective action. So it's a different perspective. And beyond STS, we started looking at a wide range of disciplines that were all starting to address or continuing to address the role of tools, devices, in order to analyze the development of markets, of capitalism, to understand how firms, but also other various forms of collective action related or not to public authority was taking place. So we started engaging in the debate with this discipline. And this second step in the research program was very much organized around this. So in this perspective, we asked a number of questions. The first one was, what is the use, what is the analytical input of this policy instrument approach? How far can we go? And this is a very academic question, I guess, in a very research-oriented question. But, you know, how far can you go using this concept and in order to explain what? Is it useful to explain all the dimensions of state restructuring or only just some of them? And how can we test the robustness of this particular concept? How far can we go? To what extent does it contribute to the analysis of public policies? And how relevant is it if we compare it with very macro explanations to more global macro perspectives, such as the bureaucratic revolution, such as new public management, such as other approaches that could help us understand the way through which power is being exercised. And a second series of questions is, what is the specificity of the public dimension of instruments? Or are instruments that are developed by firms, for example, so different than the ones introduced by the state? So what would be the difference in this case in terms of the role and the choice and selection of instrumentation? And as part of this project, we engaged in a debate with several disciplines, and this is what I would like to summarize maybe, and to give you just an idea of the work we've been doing, and maybe I can give you some references afterwards if you want to go further in this. The first big debate we had was with economists. I mean, I guess this is something that most of us have nowadays in public policy schools. We start engaging in a debate with economists. And part of our debate with economists was about the paradigm of limited rationality. And of course, this is an ongoing debate. It's been going on since Herbert Simon. This is a big debate. But in the book and in the project, we started looking at the way through which markets combine or not with states in order to produce a stabilized representation of policy issues, a stabilized representation of given problems, but also the political dimension of this relationship. So in this set of questions, we had authors such as Francis Godard, or we had people such as Berry, Moidon, Attuel, who started looking into this debate within economists about the role of tools and devices in order to understand the functioning of markets, in order to understand rationalization processes, the process through which budgets and finances are being reduced, the way through which capitalism is being transformed, the way there was a process of depoliticization routines taking place. And in this context, some of our colleagues, such as Godard, have been looking at the way through which natural resources are being managed and the way through which a number of new devices were introduced in order to address issues such as climate change, for example, but also issues such as the management of environmental resources. A second debate was within political science. And the three of us are political scientists, and we very much engage in a debate with our colleagues from political science. And the debate was more about the institutionalist dimension. So how relevant is this institutionalized dimension? How relevant is the idea to understand policy instrument as an institution and not just to understand it as a tool, in a functionalist perspective, but also to think about the role of institutional framework vis-à-vis more socio-historical approaches, or such as the work done by Philippe, for example, who works more on discourses, on representations, the way through which this institutionalist perspective can help us better understand the processes of change over time. And finally, we also had a debate with our colleagues from public policy studies. I don't know if you're familiar with the work by Ed Page, but Ed Page believes is that policy instruments don't matter. You need to look at what the government does, the regulation that is being produced, but instrumentation, policy instruments don't matter that much in order to explain what he's looking at. And he has a very nice chapter in the book arguing that actually policy instruments don't really matter, and you should focus on other dimensions, such as regulation, lawmaking, decree making. This is his perspective. Then we had scholars such as Peter John, who have been arguing that policy instruments matter in a context, in an informational context, and maybe public policy scholars should focus more on communication devices. They should focus more on how information is being produced, on big data, on the digital approach to these policy instruments, and that maybe this is the way forward in order to understand the role of policy instruments. So, as you can see, we had a number of debates in this book about the way to engage with other disciplines, about the relevance of this approach and how to maintain it. So, in the final part of this presentation, I'd like to tell you about the four steps for future research that we have taken out of this debate, and what the three of us are now pursuing in our research, and the kind of questions and research agendas that we think is very fruitful to pursue with this approach that focuses on policy instruments. The first one is to understand the restructuring of policy processes. So it's the strong relationship between policy instrumentation on the one hand and the restructuring of policy processes on the other hand. So if you wish, in this particular sense, we're looking at the combination of instruments and the long-term evolution over time. We try to understand the way through which repertoires of policy instruments, the way they are combined with one another, is also part of legitimizing a specific political system. I've been doing a lot of work on the EU, for example, and what's extremely interesting in the EU is to see the shift over the past 15 to 20 years away from information and consultation tools and back to policy coordination tools, to techniques such as mainstreaming, such as policy integration, such as systematic review process that contribute to developing new action repertoires at the European level, which is also a way for this very contested political authority to legitimize itself vis-à-vis member states who are challenging and sometimes even exiting the EU. But maybe the UK will remain an exception. We don't know about that. And it's also a way to understand the way through which inertia takes place, the way through which the lack of change can be explained, the reproduction of cognitive frameworks, and trying to link policy instrumentation on the one hand and the restructuring of policy processes introduces a new variable, a new way to understand public policy processes by adding a new approach. A second area of research, a second step that we want to pursue, is the relationship between policy instrumentation and its effects over time, its outcomes. And in doing that, we want to avoid two different pitfalls. So the first one is to reify policy instruments, but also to understand the limits of constructivism. We had a big debate in this project with some of our most constructivist colleagues, and we strongly believe that actors do not reinvent everything all the time, and but that not everything is about innovation, not everything is the new governance or the new democracy of a new era, but in some cases we have some old-fashioned policy instruments that create some inequalities, some discrepancies over time, and we want to try to address this and highlight these long-term processes of creating new inequalities. So in this work, we always try to differentiate on the one hand between the outputs of policy, of this choice of policy instrumentation, so the results, the products, the concrete methods through which goals are being operationalized, but we also try to look at outcomes in the sense that we want to address the ability or not for policy and decision makers to effectively organize activities, to structure groups, to structure collective action in cooperation or sometimes in opposition to market devices and to even civil society devices and social cooperation devices. A third very fruitful approach, this is something I've developed lately, especially as part of the courses that I'm giving at Sciences Po, is the role of policy instrumentation in order to understand the boundaries of public policies. This is something that has been especially very, very central in a number of the work done on policy fields, on policy domains, on the way through which public policy works in silos, and to try to understand the way through which there is a strong differentiation between policy insiders and policy outsiders in the way through which rules are being done. And in this aspect, in this third agenda for research, we go very much in the direction of the work done by people such as Neil Flickstein, for example, on the institutionalization, the emergence of policy regimes, but also their stabilization and their dismantling over time. We want to understand how policies are being introduced, how they emerge, but also how they are being dismantled. And again, this very much comes from the work we've been doing on the EU, for example. I was working, for example, on this, it sounds like a very nice instrument. It's called policy mainstreaming. It was proposed by women's activists at international level in order to promote women's rights, by saying, well, maybe we can't just have a sector for women. We need to mainstream women issues through that policy government, and through this particular process, we'll manage to make women's rights and representation of women and gender issues more important through that government. And when we looked at the way through which policy mainstreaming had been introduced at international level in the UN, at the EU level, but also in a number of EU countries, we found that in terms of outcome, policy mainstreaming was a way to dismantle a policy area that had been existing for 30 years and to diffuse resources so that in the end, when most of the programs and the policies were erased in these countries at our EU level, there was no support from institutional support to collective action by women's activists, for example. So, and we saw this process not just in the field of women's rights, but also in the field of human rights would be another example at EU level, but we can also look at this in the sense environmental issues would be another idea. This may seem a bit paradoxical to you because everyone is talking about the environment, right? It's so important. But then everyone is really talking about climate change and energy efficiency, but biodiversity, what about natural resources? What about fauna and the flora protection? These are classic natural resources dimensions, and these dimensions are being progressively dismantled in a number of policy contexts that we've been looking at across Europe and at EU level. So in this sense, this third area for research is a way to explore the boundaries of public policies. How do they develop, but also how they are being dismantled? How do policy priorities evolve over time? And can we see some systematic process taking place, looking at this in a comparative perspective across a number of EU countries and beyond? The last step, and this will be my final word, has to do with the relationship between policy instrumentation on the one hand and democratization on the other hand. This is also some of the work I've been doing. I wanted to tell you more about that tonight, but and the protest society. But I think policy instrument is also a nice way to address this. But in a sense, looking at policy instrumentation and the relationship with democratization is also a way for us to make sense of the very rapid development over the past 20 to 30 years of public consultation and public debate procedures, and to look systematically at the outcomes they produced in terms of change state civil society relationship. So in this particular, in this fourth area for research, we've been trying to understand the way through which form of legitimizing public policies have evolved over time, the way through which these particular public consultation devices, information devices, public debate that are much softer, they are not constraining in any way, have been combined very systematically with more economic types of instruments, forms of economic regulation, in order to, on the one hand, to depoliticize the way through which certain policy issues are being addressed, but also to transform the way through which these choices are being legitimized vis-à-vis the wider public, and the way through which this debate is being organized. And in this particular perspective, we've been doing some work together with Christopher Hood on the way through which public policy instrumentation helps us understand the way through which policy resources and state capacities are being redesigned over time. And to give you one example, this goes very much in line with the renewed attention given to nodality, to information and communication policies, which used to be a very minor policy resource when we compare it to authority, to organization, to finances, of course. But going back to the work of Christopher Hood, it also tells us a bit more the way through which priorities and resources are being reorganized in order to think about state capacity over time. So one of the things we've been looking at in this particular area of work is the lack of automatic relationship between this type of policy instruments and democratization processes. We see new and old hierarchies taking place. We see the way through which classic interest groups have been particularly skilled at making use of this public debate and consultation devices in order to bring forward and push forward their own ideas and projects. But we've also looked at the way through which this has contributed to some major blame avoidance strategies and to pushing back responsibility also towards the public and towards civil society by saying maybe civil society should empower itself, and this has been a way also to de-responsibilize public authorities in their responsibility to take over some public areas. And this is something that we've been identifying in a number of sectors, especially at EU level. So this is another way, if you wish, to look at the logic of politicization on the one hand and depoliticization on the other hand. And I think this is one of the areas in which I think there is still a lot to do in terms of systematic research, but also to look at, in terms of a more practical lessons to be learned from this research agenda and the way through which the role of the public vis-à-vis other forms of collective action should be ascertained, maintained, reorganized, and also integrate some of these learnings in order to introduce some alternative thinking about the relationship between social groups and inequalities and between rural and urban divides, which are some of the areas that are most problematic, challenging for us, especially in a number of EU countries. And I know it relates to some of the debates you have in this continent too. So I think there is a lot of fruitful agenda for research to be derived from this public policy instrument perspective. And so I thank you very much. And I also wanted to tell you that Rosana just told me this morning that some of this work has been translated into Portuguese. I didn't know that before, so I'm happy to send you the references if you wish. And otherwise, some of this work is available in English, of course, and in French, yes. So this is, I'm happy also to send you the references. So thank you very much, and I hope I could interest you in this approach.
Obrigada, professora Charlotte. Passo a palavra para o Dr. Francisco Gaetani para que ele faça suas considerações.
Bom, é uma covardia fazer as considerações nessa hora, com esse frio, mas depois de duas exposições tão interessantes. Eu vou falar rapidamente aqui, vou só deixar duas perguntas, porque quem tem o que dizer aqui são os nossos convidados, né? Eduardo, uma coisa que me intriga no caso boliviano, foi o sucesso de Evo Morales na institucionalização de suas reformas, no reconhecimento, inclusive, de agências de desenvolvimento mainstream, como o Banco Mundial, o FMI, e o que me faz especular sobre o equacionamento daquele problema da precariedade instrumental e combinado a uma exclusão social muito grande. Nós vivemos no Brasil, recentemente, um processo de impeachment que também me deixou muito claro a falência, o fracasso de um governo em consolidar uma série de reformas, em institucionalizar uma série de transformações. E, para quem estava no governo, foi particularmente chocante o desprezo da esquerda pelas questões relacionadas a fortalecimento institucional, gestão pública, modernização do Estado, a ponto de, quando o governo cai, praticamente todo o establishment está unido contra o governo. O governo foi capaz de unificar contra si o judiciário, o legislativo, o Ministério Público, o Tribunal de Contas, a nossa curadora nacional, que é a mídia, particularmente uma emissora de televisão, e boa parte da burocracia. Isso após 13, 14 anos de governo. E eu vejo na Bolívia, a mídia naturalmente não divulga isso, mas um governo de sucesso, um governo de inclusão, um governo de crescimento sustentável, um governo bolivariano. E gostaria de entender como os aspectos institucionais das reformas foram enfrentados ao longo desse tempo, o que tem permitido a continuidade desse projeto político. Bom, para Charlotte, primeiro, queria depois, por favor, envie as referências, os livros, e muito rica a exposição. Eu fui aluno do professor Hood antes de ir para Oxford, ele era meu supervisor, mas quando foi para Oxford, eu fiquei na LSE e acompanho a produção e as discussões dele há muitos anos, e me intriga muito a questão da tecnologia. Quando ele atualiza o livro The Tools of Governance, o que a gente percebe aqui no Brasil na área de gestão pública? As reformas que têm avançado são as que têm sido lideradas pelo vetor da tecnologia. São reformas menos conflitivas, são reformas que produzem ganhos early wins, são reformas aderentes ao que se passa em outros processos da vida social. Nós hoje vivemos num mundo em que praticamente todos os cidadãos têm Facebook, Gmail, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, e um governo que vive no século XIX, talvez um descompasso muito grande, mas a tecnologia vem sendo a ferramenta, o instrumento de modernização do Estado mais exitoso, sem que necessariamente haja uma reflexão sobre isso. Um processo de baixo para cima, não digo de baixo para cima, mas um processo mais de reformas na margem, mas que redefine questões de conteúdo de governo. Um processo, às vezes, até muito despolitizante, muito esvaziador dos conteúdos significantes da esfera pública. Então, a pergunta é um pouco isso, assim, como que, no ambiente de político como o nosso atual, que é um ambiente político difícil, de confusão, de impasses, as tecnologias, como elas vêm revolucionando as ferramentas e os instrumentos de governo. Como você vê essa tendência? A França não é um país que Em geral, as suas reformas são conhecidas por liderar do ponto de vista tecnológico. Essas reformas tendem a vir mais do mundo anglo-saxão, mas é um país que tem uma capacidade de inovação, uma capacidade de criação, uma capacidade de modernização também extraordinária, e junto com outros países da Europa continental, vem sustentando um estado de bem-estar social que vem resistindo a uma série de ataques e de pressões. Então, como você vê um pouco a perspectiva das reformas na área de gestão pública, à luz da revolução digital, do tsunami digital que nós estamos vivendo e da robotização das indústrias mais contemporâneas, levando a um esgarçamento, a uma crescente dualização da economia.
Obrigada, doutor Gaetani. Passo a palavra ao professor Ziton para que faça suas considerações.
Thank you. Yes, it's late and it's very cold. You know, I come from France and say I arrived to the sun and to the good weather, but finally it was before I arrived in this room. So thank you for these two very different but very interesting presentation. I was interested to ask to the first question, to the first presentation about the situation about Bolivia. And with all the transformation of political regime in the story of Bolivia, and it's maybe a general question about Latin America. Is there something special in Latin America to think the link between the political regime and the public policy that produce in this different country? So I listen a lot of discussion about Brazil, and it's a real question for me to understand what is really specific in this part of the world, to understand what kind of this specificity can contribute to better understand for people with far away the way public policy is making in your country. And so to Charlotte, I don't know if I ask question. We know each other from a long time, so maybe we can have this discussion between in the same question about between the interest of tools to the link in South America, because I know she worked a lot about Latin America and how the situation of Latin American, is there some, for example, some tools Latin America like a lot, works a lot about this, and I heard a lot about society, the concept of society, go to society, in a lot of discussion in here, so I would like to know if it's specific tools or not. So it's very open discussion, and to link to your comment.
Passo a palavra para a professora Charlotte, para que faça suas considerações, e depois para o professor Eduardo.
So thank you to you both for the questions, and so the role of technology, and especially new technologies. I think I'd like to answer that in two different ways. The first way, as a researcher, we don't know quite yet the extent to which the role of new social medias, the role of new technologies, but also if we go beyond smart technologies of digital tools, will change the way through which political system works. For example, forms of political participation, the way through which public services are being produced. So we know a lot already through the work done by Hood and Margetts, and the way they, and Levy also, and the group they had in Oxford and at the LSE, on the way through which the first generation of tools has been producing a number of changes. But some of the evolutions that we are observing in a number of European states lately seems to lead us to the idea that we are, this is a new level, in a sense, that these tools have reached. Whether or not they are being organized and structured by public authorities and political authorities is another question. Especially in the case of France, I've been doing a lot of work on urban policies and urban governance. And when we look at, for example, the development of smart technologies in the management of services, transport, water, waste management, this kind of aspects, we see that a number of public authorities are quite helpless, really, in order to negotiate with fully integrated services and offers that are being put on the table by Mr. Google, Siemens, and large firms, and they have not been able to develop sufficient human resources and understanding and capacities to negotiate and put these services to the benefit of the wider goals that they have been defining on a political level. So this is part of the debate we have at this moment in a number of EU countries, is how to train quickly, because there is an issue of time, some of our public authorities in order to be able to understand how to use these technologies as a policy resource and not just as a new kind of constraint that will not allow them to pursue their policies. A second area, I think, and this is maybe less so in terms of research results, but some of the observations a number of us had at Sciences Po, and especially in my research unit, looking at election results those past 2 years. We saw that a number of polls institutes were less and less able to predict the results of an election. We saw this in the case of Brexit. We saw this in the case of the French election. We saw this also to some extent in the US context with the election of Trump. And indeed, progressively, Polls Institute admitted that part of the debate was going on not just in the areas and the arenas and the spheres in which they were used to looking at this evolution, but also in the social media sphere. And in this particular context, the way through which these new technologies and the way through which they create new space for public debate, for political understanding, for the framing of issues, conflicts with the way through which forms and classic forms of representation of political participation is being organized. And it still remains to be seen how the coordination between these spheres will be organized. And at this stage, I would say, I wouldn't dare to tell you that we have a solution in some of the contexts, but it raises very interesting questions in the way through which these technologies and tools, some of them not being managed, and most of them not being managed by public authorities and government, conflict, overlap with some of the classic representation spheres, and especially the spheres of political representation in any given democratic system, also challenging the issue of the publicity of public debate. So it transforms in a way the understanding we have of public debate and the way through which it functions, but we don't know quite yet the extent to which will transform what. This is what I would argue. Now, coming to Philippe, there is one thing that I have not been doing any work on Brazil. I don't know the Brazilian case that much. But I've been doing some work in Lima, and there is something, and Peru, and there is something that strikes me very much, is the growing role at the growing discussion that is taking place in a number of South American, I would take Chile, Peru, but also other countries in this continent, on trying to define a specific approach to the urban dimension. What is the urban dimension vis-à-vis the national state and the way through which urban governance is being restructured? And in the case of Peru, the tool that has been used is strategic planning. Try to find and use strategic planning tool at the metropolitan level in order to give some strength to a level that doesn't exist otherwise, but a level at which building collective action would be a way to address the management of water, the management of waste, the management of a number of issues such as housing production, the control of urban sprawl, and to try to better think together not just what is going on in informal parts of the cities and informal activities, but to link it with more traditional forms of urban production and urban governance. So this is the kind of tools I've been looking at in the Chilean and the Peruvian context.
Obrigada, professora Charlotte. Passo agora a palavra ao professor Eduardo Rada.
Gracias. Los temas que se han planteado tienen un trasfondo, que es el trasfondo que precisamente están enmarcados en el tipo de Estado, ¿no?, que en América Latina y en el caso boliviano en particular tienen determinadas características. El tema de la democracia, ¿no?, en segundo lugar, y en tercer lugar la relación entre la sociedad y el Estado, ¿no? Si tomamos en cuenta los tres aspectos, vamos a poder acercarnos, en primer lugar, al tema de qué perspectiva, qué futuro tienen los cambios y las transformaciones que se han dado en varios países de América Latina y en Bolivia, tomando en cuenta que el proceso político y las características del Estado bastante débil en relación a fuerzas externas, ¿no?, va a significar posibilidad de mantención o de continuidad de estas políticas, o más bien su debilitamiento. Considero que el punto de partida es que los países de América Latina se encuentran históricamente en una condición de debilidad estructural por las relaciones de dependencia. Ese es el punto de partida. Y esta relación de dependencia impide y ha impedido que los estados se fortalezcan, y junto al Estado se fortalezcan sus instituciones y en particular la posibilidad de tener una continuidad en la gestión pública. Por tanto, esto pasa por tomar en cuenta, en el caso boliviano, que las reformas que se han producido en el Estado, esa transformación de un Estado republicano, liberal, colonial, a un Estado todavía en construcción plurinacional, tiene como condición la participación activa de los movimientos sociales. Esos actores a los que he hecho referencia, que siempre habían estado excluidos fuera del entorno de decisiones, que comienzan a tener una presencia muy activa. Ahora, yo decía hace un momento que es un proceso en construcción, no es un proceso acabado. Y esto, por tanto, como en el caso de otros países, Argentina y Brasil también, esas reformas sociales y esas políticas sociales se ven muy rápidamente puestas en debate, e inclusive con decisiones políticas empiezan a retroceder. Y esto tiene que ver con lo que se ha podido o no acumular desde el punto de vista popular, desde el empoderamiento de la sociedad sobre el Estado. Y probablemente aquí radica uno de los temas claves para entender en qué medida la democracia ha generado condiciones estructurales para la transformación del Estado. Porque si la democracia solamente se queda en los niveles instrumentales, en los niveles formales, no hay la posibilidad de que los sectores sociales avancen sobre la construcción y el fortalecimiento del Estado. Y, consecuentemente, el Estado pueda dar continuidad a determinadas políticas. Si esto no ocurre, efectivamente, el riesgo de retrocesos y de limitaciones está inmediatamente presente, ¿no? Tomando en cuenta esto, la democracia tendría que ser considerada como un proceso de construcción de la sociedad que va empoderándose de los niveles de decisión, y que la estructura del Estado va a responder en esa medida a las demandas de la sociedad. Si esto no ocurre, probablemente esta debilidad estructural del Estado sea presa de fuerzas externas, ¿no? En el caso boliviano, ¿no?, la democracia que yo he llamado neoliberal estaba impregnada fuertemente de los poderes externos, tanto políticos a través de la intervención del gobierno de Estados Unidos como a nivel económico de las transnacionales en minería y en petróleo que tenían una capacidad de sobredeterminar la vida política. Por tanto, yo diría que tomando en cuenta la experiencia de estos 15 años en América Latina, la posibilidad de desarrollar políticas públicas propias está relacionado al grado de independencia y de autonomía que se tenga de los poderes internacionales, en primer lugar. Y en segundo lugar, la posibilidad que también se ha dado históricamente en estos años de articular políticas entre los distintos gobiernos de América Latina. Los procesos de integración han permitido, en el caso de UNASUR, en el caso del ALBA, en el caso de CELAC, con menor intensidad, una articulación de acciones que permiten tener una acción protagónica en el contexto internacional. Es decir, en la medida en que se consiga mayor independencia y mayor integración, hay mayor posibilidad en cada país de América Latina y en los países en su conjunto de tener un peso específico. Y creo que esta es una tarea todavía pendiente. Así como la democracia es una construcción en camino, también la integración es un proceso pendiente que tiene desafíos a futuro. Y creo que todavía la situación latinoamericana es una situación con grandes desafíos y grandes dudas, especialmente por lo que ha venido ocurriendo en los últimos años en Argentina, en Brasil, y la presión que recibe Venezuela, que la pone en una situación de gran inestabilidad.
Obrigada, professor Eduardo Paz Rada. Eu gostaria de agradecer a presença de todos, em particular a presença da mesa, que essa seja a primeira experiência na universidade e que nós tenhamos outras oportunidades, e certamente nós estamos dispostos a isso. Muito obrigada e até amanhã.